Hello, I'm Neve Barker. This is Counting the Costs on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Russia plans to raise tax to fund its defense budget as oil revenues shrink. So are Russians now directly footing the bill for the war in Ukraine? Is the economy really in big trouble? Harder choices to come, warns the UK Finance Minister. Labour came to power pledging to rebuild the economy. But can it deliver on its promises while sticking to its manifesto and fiscal rules? And uncertainty over an Africa-US trade deal. Millions of African workers fear for their jobs if AGOA isn't renewed. Will the pact be extended? Or will its expiry open a way for new trade partnerships? Despite Western sanctions, Russia's military spending has fueled its war economy. 3 years into the war in Ukraine, growth is stalling, energy revenues are plunging, and the budget deficit is widening. To shore up state coffers, Moscow is raising value-added tax from 20 to 22%, among other measures, reversing one of President Vladimir Putin's earlier promises. The Finance Ministry says funds will mainly cover defense and security spending. The plan came a day after US President Donald Trump said Russia was in big economic trouble, suggesting Kyiv now has a chance to win back all its territory. But is Russia's economy really in peril? Yulia Shapovalova reports from Moscow.
Yevgenia is a finance manager for a small chain of gyms in Moscow. The news that the government plans to raise taxes to get additional sources of revenue for the 2026 budget doesn't add optimism to her business. She says the fitness industry will be less affected because sports and health services are not subject to VAT, but still the impact will be significant.
The tax increase will affect us in any case, since we buy sports nutrition supplements and drinks for our clients as well as sports equipment. Our suppliers will inevitably raise prices. Plus, as the overall tax system becomes more complex, prices for accounting and legal services will grow too. So I think the rise in expenses could lead to many small businesses' closure, as they won't be able to make ends meet.
In Russia, taxes are increasing for the second year in a row. Since the beginning of 2025, a progressive personal income tax scale of up to 22% and a 25% profit tax have been in effect. And the next year, the value-added tax will be raised to 22%, but will remain at 10% for essentials like food, medicines and children's goods. For small businesses, the revenue threshold for VAT exemption will be reduced from around $730,000 to $122,000.
Life for most people doesn't seem to have changed too badly, at least here in Moscow. Shops and restaurants are open, although fewer people can now afford to buy new clothes or eat out. With increases in value-added tax, their numbers are unlikely to increase.
People in Moscow say they are already struggling with the rising cost of living.
I have no additional earnings. Everything is going up. Gasoline prices are going up, and so are food prices and rents, but wages aren't.
The Finance Ministry has openly acknowledged that tax rises and other measures are designed to cover Russia's, quote, defense and security expenses alongside fulfilling social obligations. According to government forecasts, GDP will grow by only 1.3% in 2026, meaning the economic slowdown will continue and the new budget will remain in deficit. Many analysts, though, remain optimistic about Russia's prospects. They say despite sanctions and some visible signs of economic decline, the nation continues to receive oil and gas revenue, having successfully redirected its energy exports from European to Asian markets.
Social and economic challenges will affect everyone, but I don't see them fundamentally changing the situation in the country. The budget deficit is growing, but a budget deficit of a few percent is not unique for Russia. As for the small businesses, it's set to survive in the competitive struggle. There will likely be a trend for mergers and acquisitions.
In the meantime, for Yevgenia and her team, the only way to stay afloat is establishing long-term contracts with suppliers, locking in prices and treating their customers the best way possible through personalized services and loyalty programs. Yulia Shapovalova, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
All right, well, let me introduce you to Chris Weaver, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Macro Advisory, a strategic consultancy which offers economic and political advice on the Eurasia region. He joins us from Moscow. A very warm welcome to you, Chris. Let's start with the VAT hikes, because do Russians now feel that they are, after all this, directly funding Russia's invasion of Ukraine? You're in Moscow. What does that look like? What does that mean where you are?
Well, I don't really see that. I mean, people are certainly grumbling about any price increases, as you'd expect in any country. And there is some more discussion on social media about where all this is going and how much it's going to cost and whether there'll be more tax increases to come later. The central bank and other government sources have been very eager this week and last week to highlight the fact that there doesn't need to be any additional taxes, that this is kind of enough for now. But nevertheless, as you say, there's a little bit of unsettlement because of the rising tax increases. So this one in itself isn't really a big deal. The last time the VAT rate went up from 18 to 20% in 2018, it only added about 50 basis points to headline inflation, and it was washed through in about 6 months. So the central bank are pretty much saying that this won't have any major effect, and they're still targeting 4% inflation for the end of next year.
One of the biggest oil-producing countries in the world is now currently preparing to import gasoline or petrol, however you want to call it, from Asian countries, China and South Korea, caused by the shutdown of nearly 40% of its oil refineries because of attacks by Ukraine. I mean, Chris, when I lived in Moscow more than a decade ago, I'd speak to you regularly back then, Russian friends used to describe Russia as being a petrol station disguised as a country. I mean, and now this reversal of fortune. What does this mean for the country and consumers?
Okay, well, look, first of all, I think we've moved well on from that description of petrol station. 10, 15 years ago, certainly over 50% of budget revenues did come from oil and gas taxes. And so it was very, very correlated with oil and gas prices. But now, and over the last 10, 12 years, that percentage is coming down. So, for example, this year, only 24% of budget taxes come from oil and gas. And it's not only because oil receipts have gone down, but we have seen a steady expansion in other areas of the economy and tax collection in corporate and private sectors, etc. But you're right. So the question of supply of domestic gasoline is certainly a concern. To some extent, it does happen this time of the year, or it does get a bit tight this time of the year, because in September, refineries do their annual maintenance before the winter season. So I guess Ukraine has taken its timing well, because they've hit refineries while some others were down for maintenance. So it has led to a shortage.
We know that Russia has pumped billions into its war economy in recent years, helping to temporarily at least increase the health of the economy, I suppose, to increase growth. I mean, last year, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, said Russia's economy grew by 3.2%. That's compared to 2.7% in the US, and less than a percentage point in France, the UK and Germany, all less than 1%, as I mentioned there. All that despite international sanctions, Chris. Is that wartime boom, though, in Russia coming to an end?
Yes. Well, first of all, actually, those GDP numbers have been revised. So the growth last year was actually 4.3% when it was finalized. But you are right that the big driver of growth last year was military industrial spending. It was direct spending, of course, in the military. It was procurement. But also a lot of it was to do with the kind of the spin-off out of military. In other words, paying for a lot of soldiers, paying very high wages to attract people into the military, and that, of course, then boosting household incomes and therefore household spending. So we saw a very, very strong rise in consumer spending across the board for new cars, appliances, you name it. That was a big driver last year. So as you recall, the central bank openly worried about that overheating. They got Kremlin permission to raise the interest rate to 21% last October, a record high, specifically to cool the consumer economy and to bring inflation down. And it has worked. Maybe it has worked too much, because this year, the first half of the year, growth has only been a little bit over 1%, but 1.2. And therefore, for the full year, we're looking at about between 1 and 1.3% for this year. So it's come rattling right down, and the boom is definitely over. But at the same time, you can't say that this is leading to any sort of crisis or assuming it'll go into recession. It does seem as if growth is relatively stable, but at this much lower level for this year and next year, assuming nothing, of course, changes geopolitically or on the major sanctions front.
Well, Chris, let's assume something does change politically on the geopolitical front. I mean, if indeed growth is stabilizing rather than increasing in Russia, might this be an incentive for Western powers to tighten up the squeeze when it comes to further sanctions? Or is there any anticipation in Russia, in the banking sector, economically, that that might be the case?
Well, look, we're always doing scenarios to what ifs may happen. And for sure, I think the big concern is that President Trump would follow through with his specific threats, which is to target Russia's oil customers. Now, that probably would be very damaging. We have seen many times in the past where countries like China are much more wary of US counter-sanctions. And if those new measures were to come in, China would certainly stop buying or greatly reduce the purchase of Russian oil, which would then lead to certainly to budget pressures, even though, as I mentioned, oil and gas is now less than 25% of budget receipts. A big hit, of course, would make a big difference. At the same time, though, that would not tip Russia into a crisis or into recession, because the country can afford to run a bigger budget deficit for several years. Now, one of the reasons why people have been talking about a possible crisis is because they've been looking at the size of the budget deficit relative to the amount of money available in the National Welfare Fund. And you could calculate that clearly this is running down. But the government has now changed tack. They've now decided that they're going to fund the budget deficit by increasing local borrowings. And there is plenty of money in Russia to fund that borrowing. And Russia's government debt to GDP is only 16%. So they have significant scope to borrow from the local markets to cover an expanded budget deficit for several years. So even though the US sanctions, if they were to come in the form, threatened, it would cause a strain. At the same time, it wouldn't cause any immediate crisis.
All right, Chris Weaver, CEO of Macro Advisory. A pleasure to have you on Counting the Cost. More than a year after Britain's Labour Party won a landslide election victory, its popularity is sliding. The rise of the right-wing Reform Party, fueled by frustration over the economy and immigration, is adding pressure. At the party's annual conference in Liverpool, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has tried to win back the trust of the British people. He's pledged to rebuild public services and lift living standards, while Chancellor Rachel Reeves warned harder choices lie ahead in her November budget because of tough global headwinds. The scale of the challenge becomes even clearer when you look at the numbers. Britain's economy was the fastest growing among the group of 7 large advanced economies in the first half of the year, but that momentum has slowed. The annual growth rate is expected to remain at around 1.5%, the same sluggish pace it managed since 2008. The job market is cooling too, with job vacancies falling by nearly 6% between May and July. The fiscal watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, is expected to downgrade the UK's productivity outlook, and that could widen the gap in public finances by around $40 billion, as according to some forecasts. And it's fueled speculation on whether Chancellor Rachel Reeves will cut spending or raise taxes to balance the books without breaching the Labour manifesto. The government's borrowing in August hit the highest level for the month in 5 years, adding even more pressure on Reeves. She's pledged to stick to her self-imposed fiscal rules, ensuring debt is falling and day-to-day spending is covered by tax revenue. But that promise is becoming harder to keep. Despite pledges by Reeves to deliver the most pro-business government the country has ever seen, business confidence remains weak. She's angered employers by raising national insurance contributions in her first budget last year. And on the political front, Nigel Farage's Nationalist Reform UK party is posing a serious challenge to the Labour government with its hard anti-immigration stance, seeking to revive its plummeting approval numbers. Prime Minister Keir Starmer accused Farage of trying to divide Britain.
They want politics to be a choice between globalists and nationalists, to draw a dividing line between the elites and the people, in which somehow our rich story of patriotism and pride, our common cause with working people, our deep roots in the trade union movement in our communities, the desire and demand of working people for a voice in their future is claimed by those who have nothing in common with them or their values. Only a cynical intent to exploit their fears to benefit themselves. That is what we're up against.
Well, joining us now is Jonathan Portes. He's a professor of economics and public policy at King's College London and one of the signatories who wrote to the Chancellor with proposals on how to stabilise public finances. He joins us from London. A warm welcome to you, Jonathan. So we've just heard from Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, the leader of the UK Labour Party, a party traditionally of the working class left that, as we know, has drifted very much to the centre ground in recent years, doing everything possible, he was appearing to be at least, to remind people the party is first and foremost about prioritising working people. Why do you think he felt the need to stress that?
Well, he's trying to stave off the threat from the populist right, and in particular reform, which is, as with other populist right or far right parties in Europe, trying to say that the slow growth and sluggish growth in living standards of the last 15 years or so in Britain, as in other European countries, is the fault of immigrants rather than more general other economic factors. Of course, this is not true, but it has frankly, been a very successful strategy for far right parties across Europe. And while the UK has avoided much of that up to now, Reform are now indeed leading in the opinion polls, and they are particularly strong in some of the areas where Labour was particularly strong in recent years, in past years, in some areas of the north of England, for example. And Starmer is clearly trying to both push back against that by adopting more right-wing policies on immigration, but at the same time saying that the Labour, rather than Reform, has the answer to the UK's economic problems.
We know, Jonathan, that the November budget is looming. At the time of recording this programme, the Office for Budget Responsibility hasn't downgraded the UK's productivity outlook yet, but it is expected to do so, which would leave the Chancellor with an even bigger fiscal hole to fill, wouldn't it? Reeves clearly said that harder choices were to come. Are we going to see more tax hikes come November?
Yes. The simple answer to that is yes. There are going to be significant tax hikes. We don't know exactly what the Office of Budget Responsibility will do, but we do know that the UK medium-term fiscal position is weak. That is clear in the numbers. It's clear from market reactions. It is very, very difficult to reduce spending at the moment, given that many public services are under some pressure after a long period of austerity. So taxes can and should go up. The choice for Reeves is not whether taxes go up, but what sort of taxes and how. And I think, as the letter that I and others wrote said, it's important, first of all, that those taxes should be directed at those people and groups who can most afford it, which is frankly primarily better off and relatively older people like me and people older than me who have relatively good pension provision, often own their own houses and so on, and can afford to pay it. It's also essential that those taxes should be reformed in a way that is friendly to growth and business, in a way that frankly has not been in the past. So she needs to pull off the trick of increasing taxes, but at the same time doing it in a way that is positive for growth. And we believe that that is possible, but it will require some fairly bold and possibly politically difficult decisions.
When it comes to tax hikes, are there any red lines, you think, for the Labour Party? Will Rachel Reeves breach the manifesto commitment not to raise one of the big three taxes, income tax, VAT, national insurance contributions for employees?
I think it's unlikely she will directly breach the red lines. It is possible that I think it would be more likely that they would introduce some sort of, and I hope, frankly, that this is what they do, some sort of more radical tax reform, which might involve, for example, some sort of additional levy on older and better off people to pay for the costs of health and social care, which of course are the main pressure on the government budget.
Jonathan, let me put you on the spot. Can the Labour Party save the UK economy? And importantly, do you think British voters will have the patience to see Labour's plans fall through?
The UK economy, while it is not particularly healthy, as you said, it's not particularly weak either. We're struggling with many of the problems of other advanced economies in Europe and elsewhere, and many of the consequent political problems as well. But we're still a relatively rich, prosperous, productive society where most people have a job and most people do okay. So the basic strengths of the UK economy are still there. And Labour has 4 years, it has a majority, it can reshape the tax system, it can reshape the economy if it takes bold decisions, if it explains those to people, if it convinces the public of what it's doing and why. Whether it can do that, I genuinely don't know. That, fortunately, is not my job, but I certainly hope so.
Jonathan Porter, it's a pleasure to have you on Counting the Costs. Many thanks.
Thank you.
For 25 years, the African Growth Opportunity Act, or AGOA, has been at the heart of US economic engagement with Africa. The trade pact has given 35 African nations duty-free access to the American market, and it's helped attract investment, create jobs and build industries like manufacturing. But now the future of AGOA is in doubt. The pact expired at the end of last month, and its renewal is uncertain amid President Donald Trump's tariff policies. Washington has signalled it may extend the deal by a year. African unions warn more than 1 million jobs could be at risk if it's not renewed. Well, that is a growing concern in South Africa, the continent's biggest US trade partner under AGOA. Harry Matassa reports from Jazeera, formerly known as Port Elizabeth.
This community rehabilitation center was recently looted. Tamsanka Kevu says the criminals stole everything, even the windows. At night, it becomes a drug den where homeless people sometimes sleep. He says rising unemployment is to blame, fueled in part by mass layoffs at nearby automobile plants.
It became a major contributor to a sudden rise in drug addiction, which has led to an increase in the crimes that we see in our community, because we didn't have crimes of this nature in the past. So these are new crimes which have emerged and are directly linked to the economic situation of certain households.
A new 25% US tariff on cars and parts has led to layoffs here, as some companies lose contracts in the United States.
It has a huge impact on communities because for every single person that's employed, they support approximately 5 people and in some cases up to 10 people. And also as companies, if you have companies exiting a market, for example, they also do a lot of corporate social responsibility support and other initiatives that benefit the community.
Then there is the African Growth Opportunity Act, or AGOA, a 25-year-old trade deal that gives some African countries duty-free access to the US market. Some business owners say scrapping or renewing the trade pact makes no difference.
The whole point about AGOA was to allow African companies to come into America to sell their products in America with no tariffs. But now I've got 30% tariffs. So what does AGOA mean to me? It means nothing. So I know our government's busy negotiating, but don't worry about that. Deal with the tariffs. Get the Americans to drop the tariffs.
Economists and union leaders say African governments have to move faster and find new trading partners or expand in existing markets.
Our failure to diversify our economy is our own pain now, because we're feeling the pain, because mother plants, whether in Europe or in the West, US, are making decisions on our behalf, and there's nothing we can do. So the more we use what we have as our primary products, commodities, and diversify, beneficiate, create more employment, that's what is going to salvage the situation, as it were.
US President Donald Trump says introducing tariffs will protect American businesses from foreign competition and also increase domestic manufacturing and jobs. For thousands of people now out of work, the future looks bleak. Harry Matassa, Al Jazeera, Counting the Cost, South Africa.
Well, joining us now from Accra in Ghana is Daniel Amata-Anim. He's the chief economist at the Policy Initiative for Economic Development in Africa, an economic and policy think tank. Thanks for joining us and counting the costs, Daniel. So the Trump administration has signalled, tentatively at least, its support for renewing the 25-year-old AGOA trade pact. Can you confirm that it will indeed be renewed? And what are the consequences of this trade agreement lapsing?
Yeah, thank you very much. After the implementation of the AGOA initiatives, it had led to the development of the textiles industries in Africa. Countries took advantage to develop their textiles and then the garment industry. I recall in Ghana, at that time, there was even a presidential initiative to encourage production of textiles and exportation to the American market. Jobs were created along that value chain. Okay, so it has been a very significant initiative, benefited most African economies, and it enhanced our textiles industry. Now with this new approach from Trump administration, it appears that if he's unable to renew the AGOA initiative, it could affect job creation in Africa. It will affect revenue generation because the earnings from the exportation of textiles to the American market could affect revenue generation, okay, and possibly even affect the value of the local currencies in respect of the respective countries that export to such economies. If you look at the countries like Lesotho, Mali, Kenya, Botswana developed, and even South Africa developed their textiles industry significantly as a result of the AGOA initiative. So any move, any initiative by the Trump administration not to renew may significantly affect such economies.
We know the United States imposed a slew of tariffs on multiple African trading partners on April the 4th. Does this in any way contradict AGOA? Do they override this pact?
Yes, I believe strongly, and with what I have gathered and monitored, okay, on the global space, America is not happy about China's presence on the continent, and the only way to do that is to find out what is it that China is doing. China is giving loans to African countries. They are giving direct support and intervention. Okay, so how do I mitigate that? To mitigate that, maintain AGOA. To mitigate that, find a way of supporting, making direct investment on the continent. If that is done, you neutralize China's presence on the continent. But in all of this, all that we are asking for is about mutual respect and fair negotiations, not exploitation. I think this time around, Africa is emerging and we are not ready for exploitation. We want a fair deal that will benefit all parties.
Daniel Amata-Anim, pleasure to have you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks.
It's a pleasure being on your platform.
And that's our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X. I'm at Neve Barker, and use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Neve Barker from the whole team here in Doha. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.